The conflict in Southeast Asia remains one of the most challenging episodes in modern history, fundamentally testing the political and military foundations of the United States. This long, complicated war challenged the American military in unexpected ways and severely strained the nation's social cohesion. Over the course of America's involvement, the commitment evolved dramatically, shifting from a small-scale advisory effort to a major campaign characterized by conventional combat operations often fought against the North Vietnamese Army, a near-peer adversary. Yet in the final years of the commitment, the U.S. Army once again returned to an advisory role, gradually transferring responsibility for the fighting back to the South Vietnamese government. The legacy of this conflict is fraught for both American society and its army, especially following the U.S. withdrawal in 1973 and the final victory of North Vietnam in 1975. Understanding this complex history requires tracing the evolution of American strategy, focusing intently on the efforts to build an effective local fighting force, manage international alliances, and adapt to a constantly shifting battlefield that blurred the lines between conventional warfare and relentless insurgency. The strategic necessity of developing a viable indigenous security force to fight an insurgency is fundamentally obvious. However, turning this concept into reality proved immensely difficult in Vietnam. The American training mission spanned 5 loosely defined phases, beginning with U.S. assistance to the French during the First Indochina War and concluding with the total withdrawal of U.S. forces after the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973. Initially, in the early days of the First Indochina War, the U.S. involvement was minimal. This changed significantly around 1950, when senior U.S. policymakers viewed the conflict as a crucial battle against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The first members of the Military Assistance Advisory Group Indochina arrived in Saigon in September 1950. During this initial phase, the U.S. training role was negligible, focusing instead on providing military aid, including weapons, munitions, and equipment, directly to French forces. Between 1950 and 1954, the United States provided over $2.6 billion in military aid, ultimately funding 80% of the French war effort in Indochina. Following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the subsequent signing of the Geneva Accords in 1954, the second phase of the U.S. training mission began as the French embarked on their 2-year withdrawal. President Dwight Eisenhower determined that the United States would take on the formidable task of building South Vietnamese forces capable of resisting the growing communist insurgency. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles argued that assisting in the reorganization and training of the National Army was one of the most effective ways to strengthen the Vietnamese government. This view prevailed despite warnings from Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway that such an undertaking would be hopeless without a pre-existing, reasonably strong, stable civil government. Ridgway's warning proved tragically prescient. The regime in Saigon, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, was plagued by widespread corruption, inefficiency, and nepotism. Furthermore, deep social, ethnic, and religious divisions afflicted the countryside. These systemic issues severely undermined the mission to build and train a functional South Vietnamese force capable of fighting the insurgency. In February 1955, the Franco-American Training Relations and Instruction Mission, TRIM, was established in Saigon to create and train the South Vietnamese Army. TRIM was later replaced by the Military Advisory Assistance Group Vietnam, MAG-V, in November 1955. By early 1956, the Americans had formally taken over the mission of developing the South Vietnamese armed forces from the departing French. The third phase of the U.S. training effort focused on developing a 3-tiered security system. At the base were the Self-Defense Corps, part-time village militias providing local defense against guerrilla raids. Next was the Civil Guard, company-sized militias organized at the province level for regional security and constabulary duties. At the highest level was the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. It was formed from the remnants of the National Army of Vietnam, a force that many South Vietnamese viewed with suspicion because of its prior association with French colonial forces. The VNA was already suffering from high desertion and defection rates, and by 1954, its combat capabilities were described as having experienced a complete breakdown. The U.S. advisors faced a colossal challenge in transforming this unsteady foundation into a viable army. A crucial early decision involved determining the purpose of this new army. Although there were initial efforts to focus on civic action and pacification, the rapidly escalating insurgency eventually led to a shift. The primary focus became preparing the army for the worst-case scenario, an external invasion by North Vietnam, drawing heavily on the recent U.S. experience in South Korea. Consequently, the American training mission concentrated on creating a conventional military force structured around field divisions designed to resemble U.S. Army light infantry divisions. U.S. tactical doctrine was utilized to train these units, effectively attempting to make the ARVN look like the U.S. Army. While a counter-guerrilla force might have been more effective against the fledgling insurgency, the ARVN was structured primarily to meet a conventional external threat from the People's Army of Vietnam, rather than the immediate struggle against the National Liberation Front. By the close of 1959, a substantial training system had been established, including 18 schools and training centers capable of training about 20,000 soldiers annually. Individual training was successful, but collective and unit training proved profoundly problematic. Many South Vietnamese military leaders were political appointees who prioritized palace intrigue and political alignments over military performance, making them hesitant to devote the necessary time and effort to rigorous collective training. Operational requirements, stemming from the continuous fight against the insurgents, meant that most units remained committed in the field, making it almost impossible to institute effective collective training exercises. The U.S. effort was also hampered by a severe lack of unity of command, as the military had minimal influence over paramilitary forces like the police, which remained under the control of American civilian advisors. When these paramilitary forces failed to secure the countryside, the ARVN was forced to divert its attention to internal security functions, further impeding its training and professional development. The American advisory effort faced serious systemic difficulties. Advisors, eventually assigned down to the battalion level, were tasked with everything from training and staff operations to logistics and planning. Finding enough qualified American military personnel for these crucial advisory roles remained a constant challenge. Many advisors had little or no combat experience, and very few possessed practical knowledge of counter-guerrilla training. Furthermore, language skills and familiarity with Vietnamese culture were rare among the advisory corps, severely limiting their overall effectiveness. The establishment of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam MACV, in February 1962 aimed to command and control the expanding advisory mission, but the core problems persisted. Perhaps the greatest obstacle was the crippling lack of qualified leadership, both commissioned and non-commissioned, within the ARVN itself. This leadership vacuum was an unfortunate consequence of the rapid expansion of the South Vietnamese military without a solid base of experienced leaders to draw upon. By 1963, the military and political situation in South Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. The ARVN suffered a series of battlefield defeats, symbolized vividly by the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963, where an outnumbered Viet Cong force inflicted a stunning loss on elements of the 7th ARVN Division. Political turmoil peaked in November 1963 with the coup and assassination of President Diem and his brother. Although the number of U.S. personnel had climbed to over 160,000 under the Kennedy administration, this political instability seriously undermined the South Vietnamese forces, halting any significant progress against the insurgency. President Johnson, who succeeded the assassinated Kennedy, affirmed his commitment to continuing the course in Vietnam. He faced a complex dilemma: combating an externally supported insurgency while simultaneously dealing with an effective invasion of conventional forces from North Vietnam moving supplies and personnel down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Clearly, the U.S. aid and advice provided up to that point had failed to create an effective fighting force. The dire situation ultimately necessitated the massive commitment of U.S. combat forces simply to stabilize the Republic of Vietnam and prevent total military defeat. Shifting focus: conventional war and coalition building. The introduction of U.S. ground troops marked the fourth phase of the U.S. advisory effort. The focus of MACV shifted dramatically away from advising and building up the South Vietnamese forces toward large-scale combat operations conducted by conventional American forces against the VC and PAVN. The ARVN was effectively relegated to pacification efforts and providing security for the civilian population. By 1966, the immense U.S. buildup had completely eclipsed the advisory mission, transforming it into a secondary endeavor. Advisory activities became mere adjuncts to the operations of the larger American ground combat units in almost every location. This decreased emphasis meant the training missions suffered from insufficient resources. Manpower priority went to U.S. combat units, leaving advisory teams often under strength and filled with personnel lacking the required rank, branch, or experience. By 1968, MACV was short about 2,500 authorized advisors. Often the main qualification for an advisory assignment was simply availability, and specialized training in South Vietnamese history, culture, or politics was frequently neglected. Advisors were left to navigate an alien culture with few guidelines, leading to difficulties in building the crucial trust and rapport with their South Vietnamese counterparts. Furthermore, the entire advisory effort was hampered by the 12-month tour length, which created revolving-door advisors who lacked the continuity needed to tackle long-term systemic problems like corruption and leadership development. As the United States escalated its commitment, President Johnson sought to demonstrate international legitimacy for the war effort through the More Flags program. This concept, traceable to 1961, posited that involving forces from other nations would strengthen the U.S. position politically, both domestically and internationally, and help mitigate charges of American imperialism. Johnson launched a public international appeal in the spring of 1964 for free nations to support South Vietnam's fight against communism. He hoped that Allied flags would unite to stop the spread of communism. Secretary of State Dean Rusk made the More Flags program official in May 1964, urging American embassies worldwide to solicit material and political contributions. The nature or amount of aid was secondary. The important fact was that the aid was being made, thereby demonstrating international support for both the government of South Vietnam and U.S. policy in the region. However, the initial appeal did not generate significant results. Attempts to involve the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, failed, as the diverse membership perceived the communist threat differently and declined concerted action. A frustrated President Johnson noted in July 1964 that the actual performance of allies did not demonstrate that they recognized their share of the responsibility.
The effort intensified in late 1964 as the U.S. commitment deepened. To sweeten the pot, Johnson directed the State Department to notify allies that the United States would pay the entire cost of any free world military aid commitment to South Vietnam. This attempt to buy support failed to bring in any previously uncommitted countries immediately. Saigon itself showed ambivalence toward the program, viewing it as primarily a U.S. public relations campaign. Culturally, the South Vietnamese, having fought foreign invaders for 1,000 years, were hesitant to invite more foreign troops onto their land. Despite resistance, the U.S. pushed harder for military aid and combat troops. 5 nations ultimately joined the United States in providing direct military assistance: the Republic of Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. 4 provided combat troops. The Republic of Korea, or ROK, eventually deployed an infantry division and a Marine Corps regiment, totaling 20,620 soldiers by late 1965. Australia committed a task force, growing to over 8,000 troops by 1967, and New Zealand's commitment grew to about 1,000 troops. These 2 nations bore their own costs, motivated by the conviction that a communist victory in Vietnam could destabilize the rest of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, directly threatening their security. In contrast, the participation of Thailand and the Philippines required significant financial compensation from the U.S. The U.S. paid approximately $50 million annually to train, equip, and supply the Thai contingent, which grew to over 11,000 troops. Similarly, the Philippines received $39 million in military aid between 1967 and 1969 for its 2,000-man Civic Action Group. While nations like France and Great Britain refused troop commitments, citing anti-war sentiment at home or concerns over U.S. distraction from European commitments, the More Flags effort resulted in thousands of free world military forces fighting alongside Americans and ARVN troops. Total casualties suffered by these forces reached 5,241. although these allies contributed significantly, Johnson's dream of a strong international consensus supporting the war never materialized, and the conflict remained predominantly America's war. The main analysis of battlefield operations and strategy. The U.S. strategy during the height of the troop commitment, 1965 to 1967, largely centered on finding and destroying enemy forces in a war of attrition. Operations were characterized by search and destroy missions conducted away from populated areas, utilizing air mobility and heavy supporting fires to eliminate the enemy and his base areas. The difficulties inherent in this approach were starkly demonstrated in major corps-level operations conducted in the region surrounding Saigon. 3 Corps Tactical Zone. Lieutenant General Jonathan O. Seaman, commander of 2 Field Force Vietnam, IFVV, directed operations aimed at clearing key VC base areas, including War Zone C and the Iron Triangle. Operation Cedar Falls targeted the Iron Triangle, a VC staging area just 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon, in January 1967. The mission sought to destroy enemy infrastructure and forces before they could escape to Cambodian sanctuaries. The hammer and anvil strategy employed 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnam troops encircling the area. However, the enemy proved highly elusive, frequently fleeing across the border or hiding in complex tunnel systems. While resulting in 750 confirmed enemy killed and substantial supply seizures, the operation was marred by the controversial forced relocation and subsequent destruction of the village of Ben Suc, which generated a public relations nightmare. Claims that the Iron Triangle is no more were quickly refuted as the VC rapidly reoccupied their base areas after the Allied forces left. This demonstrated the critical difficulty in counterinsurgency when operating near protected borders, as forces could only clear an area but lacked the resources to hold it permanently. This dynamic resulted in a bloody, escalating stalemate.
The turning point, the 1968 Tet Offensive. By late 1967, President Johnson was running a public relations campaign, the Success Campaign, emphasizing that progress was being made to bolster public support for the war, despite mounting domestic opposition. General William Westmoreland reinforced this narrative, claiming in November 1967 that American troops could begin to withdraw within 2 years or less, and that the end begins to come into view. These optimistic statements built high public expectations that were about to be devastatingly shattered. In early 1968, the Communists launched a massive general offensive during the Tet New Year holiday. The decision stemmed from an internal debate in Hanoi, where proponents of a decisive nationwide offensive, like Le Duong and General Nguyen Chi Thanh, overcame those advocating a protracted war strategy, like General Vo Nguyen Giap. Resolution 13 called for a spontaneous uprising in order to win a decisive victory in the shortest possible time. The plan's central goal, Phase 1, was a countrywide assault on South Vietnamese cities and military installations, aiming to provoke a general uprising among the southern people and shatter the Saigon government. The Tet Offensive represented what was later called the worst intelligence failure of the war. Allied forces knew a large-scale attack was likely, but MACV grossly underestimated the scope and timing. This failure stemmed from several critical issues. First, MACV had purposefully downgraded estimates of enemy strength in late 1967, reducing the Viet Cong PAVN order of battle by removing local militias from the count. Analysts became mesmerized by a statistic of known doubtful validity, disregarding mounting evidence because it contradicted prevailing assumptions of progress. Second, analysts frequently dismissed captured documents outlining the offensive as wishful thinking or propaganda because the scale of the plan did not pass their logical test of enemy capability. Third, there was a profound failure in fusion. Allied intelligence agencies operated independently and rarely shared information, impeding the synthesis of numerous warning indicators into a cohesive picture. Faced with conflicting reports and focusing heavily on diversionary threats like the buildup at Khe Sanh, commanders failed to predict where the main blow would fall. The attacks commenced in stunning fashion. One of the most spectacular attacks involved 19 Viet Cong sappers raiding the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, proving that no place in Vietnam was truly secure. News of the widespread attacks and vivid media coverage came as a great shock to the American public. The most prolonged and brutal fighting occurred in Hue, the ancient imperial capital. Hue was deeply venerated and had previously remained relatively untouched by the war. The North Vietnamese plan, directed by General Tran Van Quang, involved a division-sized assault designed to capture the city quickly and trigger a population uprising. The city was divided by the Perfume River into the modern southern sector and the northern citadel, an imposing 30-square-mile fortress with 30-foot-high walls. The citadel was viewed as a rifle-toting infantryman's nightmare. When the attack began on January 31, 1968, the Communists quickly overran virtually all of Hue. Brigadier General No Quang Trong, the first ARVN commander, managed to hold his headquarters compound, but the gold-starred NLF flag soon flew over the citadel. Crucially, as the PAVN and VC consolidated control, political officers initiated a reign of terror, rounding up South Vietnamese government officials, intellectuals, and foreigners. Thousands of civilians were later found massacred and buried in mass graves. The initial Allied response was hampered by severe underestimation of enemy strength. Brigadier General Foster LaHue, commander of Task Force X-Ray at Phu Bai, initially believed only a small diversionary force had entered Hue and sent only a single Marine company, A by 1, to relieve the Mac V compound. This company immediately encountered intense resistance, getting pinned down by heavy machine gun and rocket fire. Even after subsequent Marine attempts to cross the Nguyen Huang Bridge into the citadel failed spectacularly and resulted in heavy casualties, senior U.S. command still reported that the enemy has approximately 3 companies in the Hue citadel. The battle to retake Hue became a protracted, bitter affair. Allied forces faced a unique constraint. Initial rules of engagement limited the use of artillery and close air support to minimize collateral damage to the historic city. This restriction made it very difficult for the U.S. Marines, who were untrained for close-quarters urban combat, to dislodge the deeply entrenched NVA and VC. The fighting devolved into a slow, methodical, house-by-house, room-by-room clearing, resulting in high casualties. The lack of centralized command and control further complicated the battle, with Marines, ARVN units, and U.S. Army units often operating in isolation until Brigadier General Oscar E. Davis was placed in overall charge late in the engagement. By the time the battle officially ended on March 2, 1968, 40% of the city was destroyed. ARVN losses included 384 killed, and U.S. forces suffered 221 killed. While the Allies ultimately ejected the Communists, the intelligence failures and fragmented command structure played a critical role in the difficulties faced. The Battle of Hue served as a textbook study of the demands of urban warfare.
Despite the overwhelming tactical defeats suffered by the Communists, who lost an estimated 30,000 fighters during the offensive, severely crippling the Viet Cong, Tet was a catastrophic psychological victory for Hanoi. The scope and ferocity of the attacks convinced a shocked American public that the war was not being won, directly contradicting the Johnson administration's claims of progress. This event shattered the confidence of President Johnson and his advisors, leading Johnson to announce he would not seek re-election. The central lesson from the Tet intelligence failure was the danger of losing objectivity. U.S. officials were blinded by their preconceived notions of enemy capability and the political need to present an optimistic picture. Conversely, communist planners suffered from their own intelligence blindness, driven by ideological fervor and subjectivism, the belief that revolutionary zeal would prevail regardless of battlefield realities. They set goals that did not match the realities of the actual situation, resulting in colossal manpower losses. The post-Tet lull offered a crucial, albeit temporary, advantage to the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. General Creighton W. Abrams, succeeding Westmoreland, recognized this opportunity and implemented a clear-and-hold strategy focused on moving into rural areas previously dominated by the VC. The renewed emphasis on pacification required an integrated, unified effort, addressing the fact that insurgents utilize a clandestine political structure or infrastructure that must be targeted directly.
To achieve this unity of effort, the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, or CORDS, was established on May 9, 1967, under National Security Action Memorandum 362. CORDS was a unique military-civilian hybrid organization that explicitly placed pacification under the U.S. military chain of command, led by a civilian deputy to the MACV commander with 3-star equivalent rank. CORDS was a necessity because the prior system, which relied on uncoordinated civilian agencies, CIA, USAID, State Department, working independently of the military, had failed miserably. Robert W. Comer, who lobbied hard for the reform, became the first deputy for CORDS, using the strong mandate from President Johnson to integrate the civilian agencies into the military hierarchy. Comer successfully consolidated resources, gaining control over programs like New Life Development, Refugee Assistance, the National Police, and the Chi Hoi Defection Campaign. CORDS mirrored the military's command structure down to the province and district levels. Province senior advisors, military or civilian, assisted the province chiefs in administering pacification, overseeing a staff that addressed civil affairs, development, and security matters. This structure allowed CORDS to channel massive manpower and resources into the countryside, enabling a significant counterinsurgency push. By 1971, territorial militia strength, regional forces or popular forces, or RFPF, reached 500,000, and by early 1970s, statistics suggested 93% of South Vietnamese lived in relatively secure villages. Within CORDS was the Phoenix program, known in Vietnamese as Phung Hoang. Phoenix was specifically designed to target the Viet Cong infrastructure, which Hanoi viewed as the crucial building block of the revolution. The VCI cadre established a communist shadow government in villages, employing terror tactics, such as assassinating local government officials, to assert control. Phoenix began as the Intelligence Coordination and Exploitation Program, or ISEX, in 1967, serving as a clearinghouse for VCI information. After Tet, anti-infrastructure operations became a high priority. The program relied on decentralized intelligence centers, District Intelligence and Operations Coordinating Centers, or DIOCCs, to compile dossiers and blacklists on VCI suspects. The core mission of Phoenix was neutralization, which meant capturing, converting, or killing VCI members. Critics often accused Phoenix of being an assassination program. However, official statistics show that of the 81,740 Viet Cong neutralized between 1968 and 1972, more than two-thirds were captured, not killed. U.S. advisors understood that captured Viet Cong were crucial for generating the intelligence needed to find others. Dead Viet Cong do not tell about live ones. Furthermore, the program operated under special laws, or An Tri, requiring 3 separate evidences to convict a suspect, attempting to operate within a legal framework to prevent abuses. Communist testimony validates the program's impact. Lieutenant General Tran Do, Hanoi's deputy commander in the South, called Phoenix extremely destructive, and former Viet Cong Minister of Justice Truong Nhu Tong wrote that it was dangerously effective, virtually eliminating the front infrastructure in some provinces. The success of Phoenix and CORDS demonstrated that unity of effort, immediate anti-infrastructure targeting, and relying on locals like the RF and PF for execution were imperative for effective counterinsurgency.
Nixon's initial National Security Study Memorandum 1, NSSM-1, revealed stark internal disagreement. Optimistic military leaders believed progress was sufficient, while pessimistic civilian agencies argued that the RVNAF could not handle a combined VC-PAVN threat without full U.S. support. Despite this division, Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird championed Vietnamization, stating that the U.S. must turn the war over to the South Vietnamese to extricate U.S. forces. Laird saw the program as politically essential, necessary to end the war in Vietnam rather than winning it. In June 1969, at Midway, Nixon publicly proclaimed the new policy and announced the first troop withdrawal. Although the South Vietnamese president Nguyen Van Thieu was deeply troubled by the implication of abandonment, he concurred.
The term Vietnamization itself insulted many South Vietnamese leaders, who felt that since they had been fighting since the 1950s, the war had always been theirs. Vietnamization unfolded in phases, prioritizing the gradual transfer of ground combat responsibility to the RVNAF, supported by continued U.S. air, naval, and logistical assistance. The second phase focused on accelerating modernization and developing self-reliance. This effort resulted in a massive influx of modern equipment, transforming the RVNAF by 1970 into one of the largest and best-equipped military forces in the world. However, General Abrams warned that equipment alone was insufficient. Poor leadership, high desertion rates, and corruption plagued the upper ranks, making it unlikely the RVNAF could handle the combined threat in the expected timeframe. The advisory mission, crucial to Vietnamization, received renewed emphasis. Abrams persistently urged Washington to prioritize sending the most highly qualified and combat-experienced officers to serve as advisors, emphasizing that the day of the U.S. fighting force involvement is at an end, and the focus must be on preparation. Testing the RVNAF capacity. Vietnamization was tested in two massive operations where ARVN forces took the lead, supported by U.S. air power, followed by the ultimate test of the final NVA offensive. The first major conventional test came with Operation Lam Son 719 in February 1971. This cross-border spoiling attack targeted Base Area 604 and the town of Chepon along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. The objective was to disrupt the massive NVA buildup for at least one dry season. Due to the Cooper Church Amendment, U.S. ground troops were forbidden from crossing the border. Thus, no American advisors accompanied the ARVN units. U.S. support was limited to long-range artillery, tactical air cover, and helicopter assault lift. The complex plan involved nearly 20,000 ARVN troops, including elite airborne and Marine divisions. Military leaders, including Admiral Moore, assured Nixon that the South Vietnamese were capable, counting heavily on U.S. air support to even the odds. However, the NVA was prepared, ordering Base Area 604 to be held and rapidly reinforcing the area with elements of 5 divisions and supporting armor, swelling enemy strength to over 36,000 troops. Lam Son 719 quickly ran into severe trouble. The NVA massed T-54 and PT-76 tanks using combined armor and infantry frontal assaults against the ARVN positions. The North Vietnamese effectively cut ARVN aerial resupply lines with heavy anti-aircraft fire. The ARVN commanders exhibited serious difficulties in command and control, particularly in coordinating combined arms operations and properly employing reserve forces. The absence of U.S. advisors, whom ARVN commanders had grown reliant upon to coordinate U.S. firepower, was readily apparent. The resulting panic led to iconic images, soldiers clinging to helicopter skids in a desperate attempt to flee the battle. Though some ARVN units fought valiantly, the withdrawal turned into a disorganized rout. The ARVN suffered approximately 9,000 casualties and lost massive amounts of equipment. The U.S. lost 108 helicopters destroyed. General Abrams later described the situation as a big gamble. Nixon, however, declared Lam Son 719 a success, claiming it was visible proof of the success of Vietnamization. While the operation temporarily disrupted the NVA buildup and delayed their next major offensive for nearly a year, it clearly demonstrated the ARVN's critical dependence on massive U.S. ground support and advisory oversight. The second great test came during the 1972 Easter Offensive, where the NVA launched massive coordinated conventional thrusts across South Vietnam. In Military Region 3, the vital town of An Loc, located 65 miles north of Saigon on Route 13, became the focal point of the NVA main effort. An Loc was defended by 4,500 ARVN soldiers, facing an NVA force of over 35,500. The NVA initiated relentless attacks supported by tanks and heavy artillery. The city was reduced to rubble by over 78,000 rounds of shelling during April and May 1972, leaving the landscape looking like Berlin at the end of World War II. Despite the ferocious conditions, the ARVN defenders held the city, a victory President Nixon promoted as a vindication of Vietnamization. However, this success was achieved only through two essential external elements. First, overwhelming U.S. air power was indispensable. General Abrams stated that American air power and not South Vietnamese arms caused the North Vietnamese defeat, a sentiment echoed by South Vietnamese generals who conceded the city would have fallen without U.S. tactical air support. Second, the American advisors on the ground were the critical link. They were tirelessly responsible for coordinating the all-around-the-clock airstrikes and the massive resupply effort. Without the advisors and their communication links, the ARVN forces would have been unable to talk to the tactical aircraft, making the defense damn near impossible. Furthermore, advisors often served as the glue that kept them together, providing crucial leadership by example in moments where ARVN officer leadership failed. Ultimately, ANLOC demonstrated that ARVN could stand and fight, but only if fully supported by massive U.S. firepower and the embedded advisors. The final collapse. The true failure of Vietnamization became apparent in 1975, following the final withdrawal of U.S. troops in 1973. President Thieu had signed the Paris Peace Accords based on Nixon's promises of continued military support. Crucially, the accords permitted an estimated 150,000 PAVN troops to remain in South Vietnam. In December 1974, Hanoi tested U.S. resolve by attacking Phuoc Plong province. When the U.S. provided no military response, the North Vietnamese leadership concluded that the time had come for the final offensive. President Ford sought to honor the commitment by requesting $722 million in supplemental military aid, but he was blocked by a hostile Congress, unwilling to fund a war America considered finished. In March 1975, General Van Tien Dung launched Campaign 275 in the Central Highlands, successfully capturing Bon Mae Thuot. Faced with disaster, President Thieu made the fateful decision to truncate the defense, ordering a massive withdrawal from the northern two military regions, MR1 and MR2, to protect the populous heartland. The attempt to execute this strategic withdrawal quickly disintegrated into total anarchy and defeat. Lieutenant General Phu, commanding 2nd Corps, ordered an evacuation from Pleiku and Kon Tum via a poorly maintained logging road, Route 7. Command structure vanished, and panic broke out among soldiers and the massive column of refugees, resulting in the Convoy of Tears. The PAVN quickly ambushed the packed column, destroying nearly an entire corps. The retreat from Pleiku was later described as the greatest disaster in the history of ARVN, decimating 6 provinces. The debacle in Military Region 1 was equally catastrophic. Conflicting and confusing orders from Thieu led Lieutenant General Trung to order a chaotic withdrawal from Hue and then Da Nang. Soldiers, demoralized and primarily concerned for their families who were caught in the refugee flood, shed their uniforms and joined the throngs, abandoning billions of dollars of equipment. The city of Da Nang, inundated by 2 million refugees and thousands of deserters, disintegrated in its own terror, with discipline completely collapsing. In 55 days, the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces effectively ceased to function as a cohesive fighting force. The loss was driven not just by NVA superiority, but by the fatal blow to ARVN morale stemming from the U.S. failure to honor its commitments. Results and discussion. The trajectory of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam reveals persistent challenges in both military strategy and nation-building, culminating in the tragic failure of Vietnamization. The core objective of generating a self-sufficient indigenous fighting force was never realized. One fundamental strategic error was the conscious decision to fashion the ARVN in the image of U.S. forces. This natural tendency to organize, equip, and train an ally using one's own doctrine made the ARVN fundamentally dependent on sophisticated, expensive American combat support, technology, and overwhelming firepower. When this lavish support was withdrawn in 1973, the ARVN was left unable to sustain itself or withstand a conventional onslaught from the PAVN. As one post-war observer noted, the ARVN had forgotten how to walk and could no longer afford to ride or fly. The human factors proved equally, if not more, critical. The effort failed to overcome the chronic deficiencies of the South Vietnamese leadership. The initial force, VNA, was fatally flawed, and the continuous corruption and politicization of senior ARVN ranks prevented the emergence of a strong, reliable leadership base. Where leaders were aggressive and shared the hardships of their troops, as seen with Colonel Nguyut's RFPF troops at An Loc, performance was exemplary. Conversely, when senior officers prioritized personal safety or political alignment, the military structure quickly collapsed, as tragically demonstrated in the retreats from Pleiku and Da Nang. External aid, as T.E. Lawrence suggested, cannot impart the prerequisite leadership, determination, and cohesion needed to defeat a pervasive insurgency. It is inherently their war, and U.S. time is limited. The American advisory effort, though often highly dedicated, was plagued by systemic issues that limited its long-term impact. The revolving door of the 12-month tour inhibited the development of sufficient trust and rapport necessary to influence long-term institutional improvement. Furthermore, despite the later emphasis on improving advisor quality during Vietnamization, many lacked the necessary cultural and linguistic background to effectively advise on political military matters, focusing instead on technical skills. The lack of coordination among the myriad U.S. government agencies in Saigon also seriously inhibited the effectiveness of early security and nation-building efforts, a weakness only partially addressed by the formation of corps in 1967. The intelligence failures that punctuated the conflict highlight the critical necessity of objectivity in assessing threats. On the U.S. side, commanders relied on flawed, often optimistic estimates that blinded them to the magnitude of the Tet Offensive. This failure stemmed from a damaging inclination to put the best face on the military situation for political and public relations reasons, stretching the credibility gap when the reality of the fighting became public. On the communist side, their catastrophic losses during Tet were due to subjectivism, an ideological hubris that allowed them to ignore unfavorable intelligence and plan for victory based on revolutionary dogma rather than battlefield realities. The political dimensions of the conflict ultimately overrode tactical and operational successes. Operations like Junction City and the victory at An Loc, while tactically successful, provided no lasting strategic advantage because the political will was lacking to eliminate sanctuaries or indefinitely underwrite the immense support required by the ARVN. Vietnamization itself was primarily a political exit strategy, designed to appease a restless American public in Congress. Although it provided a period of disengagement, the strategy was incomplete.
The final tragedy lay in the abandonment of the commitment. The South Vietnamese, convinced by two administrations that they would receive continued air support and military aid, were left unable to fight when Congress unilaterally cut off funds. By 1975, the ARVN, dependent on American technology and support, lost its will to fight when the promised aid failed to materialize. This failure resulted not only in the decisive defeat of the ARVN, but also in the demise of the Republic of Vietnam as a sovereign nation. Conclusion. The history of America's involvement in Vietnam is a profound study in the limits and requirements of foreign military intervention. The decades-long effort to sustain a non-communist state ultimately failed because the foundation, the indigenous government and its armed forces, was unable to acquire the necessary competence, cohesion, and self-reliance to overcome its deeply rooted institutional flaws. The U.S. failed to adhere to the core tenets of effective security assistance, training the indigenous forces in a way that respects their culture and does not create an irreversible technological dependency. The persistent lack of unified effort in counterinsurgency programs, only temporarily overcome by organizations like CORDS, undermined efforts to secure the population and eliminate the insurgent political infrastructure early in the war. While tactical victories were achieved, such as those in Junction City, the Tet counterattacks, and the defense of An Loc, these successes proved strategically irrelevant. They merely bought time, failing to resolve the fundamental political and military issues plaguing the South Vietnamese state. Vietnamization, although successful in providing a mechanism for the U.S. to withdraw its troops, proved to be an ultimately incomplete strategy. It extricated the United States but failed to ensure the continued viability of its ally, particularly once the crucial commitment to provide follow-on military support was broken by the U.S. government. The consequence was defeat for the United States, which lost the first war in its history, and extinction for the Republic of Vietnam. The lessons learned were harsh. External intervention, no matter how well resourced, cannot replace the host nation's determination, resolve, and capable leadership.